Hello viewers, today we are going to discuss about some of the national instruments which are related to the biodiversity management. We all know that there is a lot of biodiversity laws. To protect over there, some of the international instruments are there, some of the national instruments are there. So today we are going to discuss about what are the national instruments and what are their themes and what they will work. So these are the national instruments list. One is the Indian Forest Act 1927 and Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and Forest Conservation Act 1980, which has been amended also after 1988, and the Biological Diversity Act 2002, the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act, and Institutional Arrangements for Biodiversity Management. So these are some of the national instruments which will be implemented to overcome the biological diversity loss. So first of all, we will see what is the first act to preserve or to conserve the biological diversity loss. The first one is Indian Forest Act, which is emerged in 1927. It is a consolidation of all forest acts before 1920s. That means prior to 1920s there were laws, legislations as well as policies, but all those have been consolidated to become as well as existing this Indian Forest Act, and it has a right as well as provision to the creation of reserved forests. This act has given a power to the central government as well as the forest departments to create a reserved forest. It also have given a lot of powers as well as the rights to the central government as well as the forest department to create a protected forest. And some of the forests have been controlled by some villages or otherwise some village communities. They are known as village forests. And the other one is, this act also provides a Forest Conservation Act of 1980. This Forest Conservation Act mainly shows that the importance of this timber value as well as the only it restricted to the timber value protection only. But meanwhile, what happened in between this 1920 as well as 1980, there are some other biodiversity values are also existing in the forest. They also have to be protected. So it has been emerged as an act of 1980 and it's also amendment in 1988. And this act also provides India's first forest policy in 1952, and this in 1952, between 1952 as well as 1980, there is a huge deforestation takes place. To overcome that deforestation and then how to control the deforestation, some legislations as well as policies are urgently required. So there is a creation of new policy framework after 1952, and Forest Conservation Act of 1980 enacted to control the deforestation that has been emerged afterwards. And there are so many regulations have been given in this act. There are so many legislations, there are so many policies. Anybody, if violate any of these rules or set criteria, they have to be punished by imposing some penalties. So these penalties are two types. One is the penalties for offences in reserved forest. So in that, what type of penalties and what are the criteria? So no one should allowed to set a fire to the forest or to clear the forest by setting a fire, and nobody is permitted to enter their cattle into the reserved forest area, because if some cattle sometimes they will make some harm to the trees, so they are not allowed, they are strictly prohibited. And this one of the criteria is also that not allowed to take forest products. There are huge biological resources are existing in the forest, whether it is a timber, whether it is a bark or tree of that any medicinal values of the plants which are existing in the forest, they are not supposed to touch. So they are not allowed to take any of the forest products for their personal use. So these are the some of the criteria to impose the penalties those who have violated. And penalties for offences in reserved forest is mainly this imprisonment for 6 months. It may extend, depends upon their violation, and or sometimes there is a provision for the fine of rupees 500, or sometimes depends upon the violation, they can be imposed for imprisonment as well as the financial fine. And penalties for offences for the protected forest. Here also, just like a reserved forest, they are not allowed to take any of the forest products. That means they are not utilize any of the biological diversity resources which are existing in the forest. And here it is also, there is a punishment, just like a reserved forest, that is an imprisonment. Maybe it is extended to the 6 months also. And forest authorities have been given that sort of charge without having any authorization from the magistrates. They can directly issue an arrest warrant against violation. So next we will move on to the next act, that is the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. This is the main aim of the Wildlife Protection Act, that is the habitat destruction due to agriculture, due to industries, urbanization and other human activities have led to the erosion of the country's wildlife. We all know that for the agricultural lands or otherwise fertile lands, highly fertile lands have been misused only because of the concretization of the cities or the urbanization of the cities. So, to protect the wildlife from these hazards, there is an existence of Wildlife Protection Act which is emerged in 1972. The activities of this act is, this clearly defines the wildlife terminology, because all acts have its own nomenclature. So, here it is also, it defines the wildlife terminology, and it has a provision to the appointment of higher authorities to protect or to conduct the various activities. And there is a provision of this act as a part of the CITES, which is existing in the 1976 to protect the wildlife trade, international wildlife trade. And it also acts as, it also helps in the listing of the endangered species in the red list, which is under the IUCN organization, and it is also protects some of the endangered plants as well as the animal species. And most important activity of this act is launching of UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program. What is Man and Biosphere program? What it does? It is an intergovernmental scientific program which aims to establish a scientific basis. So, scientific basis to understand the linkage between the environment as well as the people, and it also works with the sustainable development goals and addressing the challenges. What are the sustainable development goals, especially particular to this biosphere program? That is this simple natural habitat, to conserve the natural habitat, to conserve the all sorts of diversity in the ecosystems. And it also have a provision to set up national parks, wildlife sanctuaries to protect the animals, endangered animals as well as the plants. And it has a provision of constitution of central zoo authorities, and also it provides trade and commerce with license for sale and provision act, so on and so forth. And it has a right to impose ban on the trade in the listed animals. It will definitely provide to impose a ban if the trade in the listed animals have been doing without prior approval of the Indian government. And it have a set legal powers to the officers to control the IPR activities. So, there is a punishment offer to the offenders also, and they encourage captive breeding program, which is a most important as well as the encouraging activity, this captive breeding program, because captive breeding program is one of the program to protect the endangered animals as well as plant products, and under the captivity. Under the captivity means we are taking them from the natural environment to the man-made protecting environment, at least to protect them from the endangerment. and it is this act, unfortunately this act is not applicable to the Jammu and Kashmir. So Jammu and Kashmir is having their own act to for the application of this one. So even though all these merits are there, some limitations are also there. There is a very mild penalty to the offenders, those who have violated the set criteria, and there is an illegal wild trade in Jammu and Kashmir, because Jammu and Kashmir this act is not applicable. So there is an illegal wild trade there, we don't have any control over them. So, and one more limitation is there is a personal ownership certificate for animal articles like leopard as well as deer's skins, as well as some of the ornamental plants also. So these are some of the limitations are existing in this act. There is no coverage for foreign wildlife endangered species, and there is a less maintenance of mobile zoos. There is a pathetic situation for the animals, endangered animals which are present in the, which are existing in the mobile zoo. There is no maintenance at all, and there is a protection of plant genetic resources neglected. That means we can say that there is not much emphasis, only limited emphasis has been given to protect the plant genetic resources from this act. And next we will move on to the Forest Conservation Act. Previously, first of all, we have seen that Forest Conservation Act 1927, which has been enacted in 1980 and then amended in 1988. So here it is the that is the Forest Conservation Act. This act has 5 sections to protect the forest. This enactment of this act with twin objectives. One is restricting the use of the forest land for non-forest purpose. This is the most important limitation. So the misuse of the forest land which are under the restriction. And the second objective of this act is preventing the de-reservation of the forest which are reserved in Indian Forest Act 1927. We have seen that in 1927 there were no proper guidelines as well as regular rules and regulations to conserve the forest, entire forest. So here there is an improvement from the 1927. One is the restricting the use of the forest land for the non-forest, and the other one is preventing from the de-reservation of the forest. And it is also amended in 1988, and it empowers the central government regarding all the activities conducted by the forest, and it also provides a punishment of imprisonment and punishment of offenders from the government departments also. There is no excuse for the government departments or the central government departments. This act is uniformly executed for each and every citizen of India. And next we will move on to the Biological Diversity Act 2002. It has been what is the act says exactly. The definition of act is regulating access and documenting the officially sponsored documentation of biological resources and traditional practices through people's diversity registers at the local and databases at the national levels. So it further probes the extent to which the principles of conservation have been realized. So this act especially to protect the biological diversity resources which are existing in the forests. The main objectives of this one: conservation, sustainable use and fair and equitable sharing. That means these are the 3 pillars for this Biological Diversity Conservation Act. That means the conservation of biological diversity, that means all flora and fauna existing in the forest area, they have to be conserved, and the sustainable use of its different elements. Sustainable use, again it is without endangering them, without completely destructing, without completely loss. We have to use, we are able to regenerate also. And the third main important objective is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits by all the people. And what are the provisions in this act? There is a prohibition on Indian genetic material outside the country. Exactly. There is a prohibition. That means there is no illegal transformation or transportation of any of the genetic material without prior approval or proper approval from the central government agency. And there is a prohibition on claiming an IPR on certain issues. Some issues are technology, technological transfer and genetical resources. So there is a strictly prohibition on claiming of any of of the IPR. And the other provision is regulation of collection and use of the biodiversity, exempting from the local communities, because any Indian citizen cannot use the regulations as well as the collections of the forest products, because that forest product is localized to some of the tribes only. So, any Indian citizen, only exception is the local communities can easily collect as well as utilize those resources. And the sharing of benefits from the use of biodiversity, there is a technology, joint research, private research also we can be, it can be benefited by sharing. And the measuring the conserve sustainable use of biological resources, including habitat as well as species protection. Here again, this species means all the wildlife fauna as well as flora as well as the endangered animal species also. That means entire biodiversity species. There is a variety of life existing in the forest, existing in the earth. So, the species means the entire living things, community. And there is a provision for local communities to use the resources and to charge the fees also, because there is a provision for local, that means there is a right, the local communities have right to use the resources because they are staying in that particular region, but they can have a right to charge the fees. That means they can also trade by posing some of the charge and just the nominal amount. And the protection of indigenous law, there is a traditions, there are so many indigenous laws are there. So, we have to, there is a need to protect in the form of this act. And regulation of the use of genetically modified organisms, this is most important as well as the complex provision of this act, and setting up of national, state, local biodiversity funds to support the conservation. Various conservation activities will take in place, for that also funds are required. And setting up of biodiversity management committee at all levels, that means national level, state level, local level committees have to monitor the all activities regarding the conservation of the biodiversity. And some of the functions of authorities which have been mentioned in this act is advising, that means these authorities which are under this act, which are in the biodiversity areas, conserving areas, they have to advise the central government about the biological diversity conservation and how to conserve and then how to proceed and what are the pros and cons of these activities. They have to explain, they have to advise to the central government as well as the remaining authorities. And they also, some of the authorities which are execute at the state level also, they will also coordinate with the central government, and they have a provision for the technical assistance. That means they can also appoint the technical staff for the period of 3 years, or they can also extend it, depends upon the need of that particular area. So, there is a provision for the technical assistance as well as a technical guidance, and they can also sometimes sponsor some investigation as well as the research projects to improve or to enhance the protection or the conservation of the biological diversity. And most important is not only protecting, and they have to list out all the flora and fauna as well as the endangered animal species under the categorization as well as the set criteria given by the forest departments, and they can also publish the data of that endangered species, about their environment, about their monitoring activities, whatever it is required to the public domain. And organizing comprehensive programs as well as the training programs to the people, those who are indulged in the conservation activities through mass media. And they have also preparation for the annual budget of the authority. So, to conserve for this, all these conservation activities, funds have to be required and they have to be raised. So, this is also one of the activity for this act. And approve the method of recruitment. So, all the recruitments, all the appointments have been approved by the central government only, and they can also have a provision to the creation of the database for the each and every individual species, and it acts as an advisory to State Biodiversity Board as well as the all management committees regarding their activities. And they have to simultaneously report to the central government whenever it is required. And there is a provision for the right for the sanctioning the grants for the various activities, and they have the appointment for the legal experts to control as well as monitor the IPR issues. And this is also regulates the biosurvey and bioutilization of biological resources. So this is also very critical activity done by these authorities. And next we will move on to the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Acts. There are two main activities, there are two main themes which under this protection of plant varieties. What it do actually, what are the main activity for this act? To establish an effective system of protecting plant varieties, farmer rights as well as plant breeders' rights, and to encourage investment in and development of new plant varieties by providing protection to plant breeders' right. The best known act under this act is the Kani tribes story. There is a Arogya Pacha name of that plant. This is a medicinal value plant. This scientific name is Trichopus zeylanicus. And some tribes from these Kani tribes, they have used this plant for the medicinal purposes, and some of these tribes people, they have approached and then they have introduced this medicinal plant value to this TBGRI, that is the Tropical Botanical Garden and Research Institute, and these people have done some of the research and then they have isolated almost 12 active compounds from this plant and developed a drug known as Jeevani, and that they got the patented also. And what is the speciality of this medicinal plant? It has a medicinal values of immuno-enhancing as well as anti-stress and anti-fatigue values. And they have created a trust fund established to share the benefits arising from the commercialization as Jeevani. It will be operated within the involvement of all relevant stakeholders as well as a sustainable harvesting of the plant. So there are some of the problems in this one, even though it is a unique success story of this one, but since they are facing a lot of problems. What is that? The unique example of benefit sharing on intellectual property rights, which is claimed based on the medicinal plant genetic resources and traditional medicinal knowledge. There is a transformation of medicinal knowledge to the researchers. What are those problems? They are insecure land tenures, makes equitable benefit sharing difficult. Social hierarchies are there, and low awareness limit the capacity of local communities to stop biopiracy and negotiate for equal benefit sharing. And there is a practical difficulty in including the entire community or multiple communities, and difficulty in implementing the one of the biodiversity instrument, that is the PIC for the benefit sharing. And there is an assigning value to the traditional knowledge also. Yes, it is 100% true, because we cannot value the traditional knowledge, because that traditional knowledge is not being traded, not being marketed so far. So it is a very difficult task to assign the value to the traditional value. There are some institutional arrangements also there. So there are so many biodiversity spheres, biodiversity areas in India which are in the world famous, and 6 of wetlands the convention comes under the designated as the Convention on Wetlands, and 11 more wetlands are also there that identified for the intensive conservation and management. There are some of the institutional infrastructures which have been adopted in India, that is Indian Council of Agricultural Research and National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources and National Bureau of Agriculturally Important Microorganisms and National Bureau of Agriculturally Important Insects, as well as the Plant Genetic Resources, as well as the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. And we can conclude that this session by this one of the most important institutions, that is the National Bureau of Animal Genetic Resources. What it will do? It depends upon the activities which can conducted under this National Bureau is, it is a crop based ICAR institutes, and it also related to the National Research Center. That means it will provide germplasm, and it acts as a nodal agent for the providing the germplasm. For the crop based ICAR institutes, it also provides support to the National Research Centers, All India Coordinated Crop Improvement Projects also there, and it also extends its support to the state agricultural universities and relevant government departments, NGOs NGOs, research foundations as well as the private partnerships also.